Most of them are on. I got the whole shooting. Okay, hello everyone. This is Greg Smith at the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. We're going to get started here with the peak flow webinar, and Brenda Alcorn and I will kind of tag team through this. I'm going to mute everyone right now, and then we will unmute you at the kind of at the end, and there'll be the option to ask questions. And you can also type questions in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll check those as well.
The conference is now in silent mode.
Okay, so thanks for joining us. This is a little bit sooner than we usually do this. A lot of times we'll do this starting in mid-April, but kind of given some of the heavier snowpack and that, there's been a lot of interest and requests for peak flow information early this year. So consider what we give you here kind of an early view of things. You know, there's still quite a bit that can happen during the spring here. So we'll... as soon as my system starts working here, there we go. Going to go through several things today. It's going to be basically, we're going to talk about the current snow situation to begin with. And then Brenda is going to spend a few minutes talking about how to access the peak flow information on our webpage and how to interpret that information. So she's got a good little section on that. Then we will go get into the peak flows themselves and talk about those areas where you know we have some concern, and then talk a little bit about the upcoming weather and also just how the spring weather might affect the forecasts themselves and the resulting peak flows. So I'm trying to follow along here to see when I think your screens are changing. You know, we still have that challenge here in our office with our internet speed. The first image I'm bringing up here, those of you who've been on our water supply webinars, you've seen this before. But that's the seasonal precipitation map of our area. And, you know, the storms have really favored the Green River Basin up in Wyoming, the Yampa River Basin, Colorado River headwaters up above Cameo, up above Kremling, extending down into some of the Gunnison. And also the extreme northern Bear River Basin of southern Idaho and northern Utah. So those areas are also the areas where we're kind of anticipating, you know, more of the higher runoff, some runoff that might actually cause some issues. I'm going to bring up the soil moisture map as well, and you've seen this, but I've kind of highlighted those areas that have the heavy snowpack are the same areas that tend to have the above average soil moisture heading into the winter season. So while this combines for the water supply volumes, you know, to be much above average, it's also combining for the peak flow forecasts to be above average in these areas. Next up, we'll take a look at the snow conditions, and these are again in those same areas that were highlighted. This is the snow conditions indicated by our map on the 10th of March yesterday, and I've circled those areas where we, you know, have that really heavy snowpack. Again, you know, the same areas I mentioned: Upper Green River, Wyoming Range, Wind River Range, and in the headwaters of the Colorado Gunnison and parts of the Bear River Basin. And in these areas, we're anticipating, you know, some streams. Most streams will all be above average for their peak flows, at least the way things look right now. And many streams, several streams, may also hit critical levels. And we'll kind of go over those. I also have a graphic here. This is actually out of our hydrologic model run here at the River Forecast Center. It's kind of nice to show you just what the model sees as far as the snow. And so this is the percent of snow water. And this is, I've cut this off at the 2-inch level. So areas where there's at least 2 inches of snow water equivalent are showing up here. And so this is the percent snow, percent of the calibration period. So the percent of the 1981 through 2010 calibration period. And you can see those areas, especially in the medium and dark blue, that are really standing out with a much above average snowpack, you know, extending again in the Upper Green River Basin, down through the Yampa, Colorado River headwaters, and Gunnison River, mainly up above Blue Mesa, a little bit in the Animas River Basin, and then also over in northern Utah, parts of the Bear River Basin and the Bear River Basin in Idaho. So on the next few slides, I kind of just want to do a little quick basin tour through the snow. I'm going to focus on those areas a little longer that have the really heavy snowpack that are going to cause us a concern. The first one here is the Green River Basin, up above Fontenelle, up above Flaming Gorge, and I've thrown a couple of snow plots up here. A lot of graphs on this. I think most of you have seen these before, but the blue line is the historical average, and the purple is the historical median. They're generally usually close to one another. Last year is in the red, and the current year is in the green. So you can see how February was so wet, and just the amazing increase in the snow water equivalent at this Kendall Snowtell site. Kendall is currently, as of I think I got these yesterday, 207% of median for the day, and it's also over 185% for the peak. So anything that comes now is just bonus, and that's going to continue to potentially push the peak flow forecast higher. I plotted a couple other years on some of these, not all of them, but a couple other years that also were very high. 1986, I believe that is, and 1997. You can see we've almost climbed up to reach those levels. So, in a way, it's not bad to compare runoff on some of those years. Again, the spring has a lot to do with it, but those are some years that maybe you would compare against just to see what might go on up there. I got triple peaks on here too. It's kind of the same scenario, and many of these in the Upper Green are in their top 2 or 3 on record for this particular date. Next up, we're going to move over to the Yampa, Little Snake, White River Basin area. Not as pronounced, but still, very significant snowpack exists. The green in the Whiskey Park area, again, I believe this one's like the second highest on record for the date. You can see the other years we ended up with quite a bit more, but there's still some time to go. Kind of the bottom line on these are all above the seasonal peak at this point. So it's not like we have to get snow to just get up to an average condition. We're already going to be there. Moving a little further south, we'll look at the Colorado River area. And this is going to be the area primarily above Cameo, above Kremling. Several sites in here also have already reached the seasonal peak. You can see in the green where the snow water equivalent currently is. And they'll probably continue to go up a bit as a few more storms are at least forecast here in the next couple of weeks. So again, an area where the snowpack is sufficient for some pretty good runoff numbers as far as the peaks go. And then we get further south, things tone down a little bit. We're going to look at the Gunnison and the San Juan Basin. Above the Blue Mesa group, we're pretty much up to the average. We've hit the seasonal peak, the typical seasonal peak. We're about 130% for this time of year. And looking at some pretty good flows up there on the East River. The San Juan Basin is not doing very, very well as a whole. There's isolated areas, especially the higher elevations in the Animas River drainage. There's a few sites there that have kind of pushed the numbers there to near or a little bit above the peak, the seasonal peak so far, about 120, 125% of median for this time of year. So the Animas River looking a little bit closer to an average peak. We'll take a look. I have the rest of them kind of indicated by basin, and as opposed to just these individual groups, since the snow is not as attractive or not as significant there. The only standout, I guess, would be the Smiths Fork River Basin up in southwest Wyoming, up into this part of Idaho as well. It followed it. It got the same storm track that the Upper Green River Basin had, so you can see the significant increase up there, already 120% of the seasonal peak. And then the Logan is already up to where it typically peaks in early April. So we're looking pretty good in the Logan for at least average to above average flows. Things drop off a little bit as you get further south. The Weber Basin is at, I'm sorry, I'm kind of using average and median interchangeably, kind of getting used to saying median for snow, but they're really pretty close, in this area for this time of year. When you get down to the Weber, it's pretty much near the median and the average for right now, below the seasonal peak. So there's still a ways to go to actually climb up to reach that. And then I'm going to transfer this over to Brenda here in a moment to talk a little bit about what a peak flow forecast is. I didn't really focus on the Virgin River Basin and the Severe River Basin just because conditions there are really pretty dismal. The snowpack's very low. My Virgin River Basin forecaster is smiling over here. And, we're looking at pretty low runoff in that area. So let me pass this on to Brenda to tell you a little bit about how to interpret this. Probably a little bit of delay, about 5-6 seconds.
All right. First of all, just want to briefly go over what exactly it is that we're forecasting when we give you a peak flow forecast. So this is the maximum mean daily flow due to snow melt. And that's generally, we're looking at that April-July period. We'll talk about instantaneous flows in a minute here, but our basic forecast is for the mean daily. These are probabilistic forecasts. We give you 5 different levels. So the 50% level, there's a 50% chance that the peak will be higher, and there's a 50% chance the peak will be lower. The 10% is going to be that high end where there's only a 10% chance that we're forecasting that there's only a 10% chance that the peak flow will be higher than that value. And of course, the opposite down on the 90% end. These are regulated flows. That means so we do better in the headwaters where there's no regulation. But for points down below reservoirs and diversions, we're trying to account for those. And so we have to make a lot of assumptions a lot of times, but if we do know of some planned operations, especially maybe some peak releases and things like that out of reservoirs, we will take those into account. But basically, a lot of times we're just making some assumptions based on how those reservoirs have been operated in the past. Another important thing is we're only forecasting the magnitude of the peak with these outlooks, not the time of the peak. We have about 70 forecast points, and we're going to be issuing these twice a month this year due to the conditions. Okay, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about the instantaneous peak flow forecast because we do list those on our webpage. But those are just based on the observed relationship between the max mean daily flow and the maximum instantaneous flow at each point. And so we can only calculate those for sites where there's a good correlation between the two. So especially as you head down south, where we can have monsoon rains in this, or just heavy rains in the spring and summer, those can cause some sudden large peaks where you'll find the instantaneous peak that happens on a different day than the mean daily maximum. And so on our webpage, when I go through that, you'll see some points do not have an instantaneous peak due to that. Okay, and then I'm going to talk briefly about where can you find this stuff on our webpage. We've made quite a few changes to our webpage over the last year. So here are the direct links to both the map and a listing of the peak flows, but I'll go through and show you, if you just are on our homepage, how you can find these. Oh, okay. So, so here's our front page, and up at the top, I've highlighted the rivers, and if you hover over that, you will get a menu that will pop up. It's the same menu as you see down at the very bottom of our webpage, and on that menu are where you can get to that peak flow map and peak flow list. Okay, so if you choose the map, you will see something like this. And first thing you want to notice is the forecast date is up there at the top of the map. So that'll tell you when the latest peak flow forecasts were made that are being displayed there. Next, the colored dots, the meaning of those. Anything in green, basically, there's a low probability of reaching flood flow. Anything in red means there's a high probability. And as I go through and show you the actual forecasts, the greens will be, there's less than 10% chance, and the red means there's greater than 50% chance. So you can zoom into the area of interest, so you can see which points you want to see. If you hover over the point, you'll see the name, and if you click on the point, you'll get a graph of the peak flow forecast. So this is the listing. If you chose the list instead of the map, and again here you can see the issue date, that peak flow probability. Again, you see those dots, and here you also get what that actual flood flow is. And then you have all the listing of the mean daily forecasts, the peak forecasts. So again, we have that 90% where there's a high chance we'll be above that flow for a peak. And then we do a 75, a 50, 25, and 10. And then here for this point on the top, you can see we do calculate an instantaneous peak flow forecast. But down below, if you look, you'll see some where there's an NA in those columns, meaning we don't have a good relationship there, so we did not calculate those. Another good thing to pay attention to are the notes over in the far column that'll tell you maybe a little something extra about the point. Like this one is telling us there is a lot of regulation upstream, and we are trying to account for that. Okay, so you can customize this table quite a bit. And so in this section that I've highlighted here, anything in orange is turned on, anything in blue is turned off. So here I'm showing a sample where I have turned off the instantaneous forecasts, and I have turned on some of the historic peak, peak date, the average peak, and the normal time. We give you an earliest and latest date of when the peak usually occurs in the table. And I just want to point out that all of these values are referencing mean daily peaks, not instantaneous. And again, you can actually sort the table. Not only can you turn on and off columns, you can sort by any of those columns just by clicking on that header. So you could sort by that PI, the probability indicator, and all of your red or whatever dots would be at the top of it, so you could really see which points are forecast for higher probability of flooding. Okay, so the next thing you can get to is a plot of the peak flow forecast. And that can either be from the map by clicking on a point, or from the listing by clicking on the ID associated with it. And so here I'm showing an example, the east at Almont. Okay, so the peak forecast is the vertical green line, and I've marked where we have all the different levels on there. And in this case, that 10% forecast is just barely over the flood stage, which is the dotted red line across the plot. And so that's why that dot on the map is yellow. It gets plotted along where the issue date was. So as the season progresses, you will see more green lines starting to show up each time we issue a new forecast, like in mid-March and in the beginning of April. Oh, it didn't make it in there. Okay, and then I just wanted to point out that the other lines, like the purple line and that light blue line, those are maximum and minimum hydrographs that have occurred in the past. So the purple one is in 1918. That's when the historic peak occurred on East Almont, and that's what the hydrograph looked like. Okay, and as the season progresses, you will see there'll be a blue line that's you can't really see on this plot right now. That is for the current year, and so you'll see how the current flows are looking as well. Okay, so in terms of the time of peak, again, we don't try to forecast the time of peak this far out, especially. So as that peak nears, really the better place to be looking is on the daily hydrographs that are on our webpage. So you can get the most up-to-date information about what that forecast is. And when we do updates, if we think for the peak forecasts, if we think that the peak is coming soon, we're not going to put a number in there. It will actually say peaking soon in that table. Or if the peak has already occurred, we will also note that. Okay, so that was just how to find them and how to maybe interpret some of this stuff. And now I'll turn it back to Greg for the actual forecasts.
Okay, thanks, Brenda. And once again, I think some questions might have come through on the, I heard them ding here. So we will get to those. I just want to continue through so we can have a good recording of this. So here's an example of the listing that Brenda showed you. And I sorted it by that PI indicator. So right off the bat here, I have the list of those streams that at least the 10% forecast exceedance are hitting the flood stage. And Labarge, Green River Labarge is actually at the 50% exceedance forecast is exceeding the flood stage. So this is a great way to kind of highlight those rivers that we're starting to be concerned about and we really need to monitor, or at least and the basins that they're within. So that's one of the first examples to look at. I'm going to go through just some of the plots here now and discuss just by basin. I just picked what I thought was some of the more representative ones. And again, these are all available on our website if you'd like to look at it. But starting with Labarge, because it's kind of the one that's standing out right now. You can see again on the left-hand side of the graph, that vertical green bar that Brenda pointed out was our March 1st forecast. And you can see at the 50% level, we are actually over the flood stage. At the 75% level, just below the flood stage. So, you know, we're anticipating problems up in this area. The flood flow is listed there as well. I also threw in the average 4730, and then just for comparative purposes, I put in last year's flow. So you can see in most of these areas with the heavier snowpack, we're going to be significantly above what we had last season. And again, you know, part of this when you get like down to Green River and some of these areas below reservoirs are due to operational plans. The Green River, Wyoming, as well is showing at 50%, not quite to flood level, but we're kind of in that neighborhood. And, you know, those are areas where you really kind of keep an eye on rain events that might come in during the runoff period that could enhance the stream flows. Next up, I kind of move over into the Yampa River Basin and take a look at the forecasts over there. Steamboat, you know, almost double what we had last season or last year. And while still forecasting below the flood level at this point, it's one to watch because that 10% exceedance value up there on the left hand on the upper where the green is crossing the flood stage, you know, is indicating, you know, we're kind of in this area now. We kind of need to keep an eye on this. And you can see the blue lines on the lower right in the Milner. I believe that's a blue line in there, showing some of the obs, you know. Evidently, we were missing some of the historical trace, but on some of these, you'll see the blue, which is actually showing some of the observations that gauges that we've actually perhaps set good. The forecast at Milner, again, you know, above average. And it is also at the lower exceedance, the lower probabilities crossing that flood stage, the dashed red line. Both of these are well above the bank full. So again, it just kind of brings your attention that you'll want to keep an eye on these as we progress into the season. Next up, move into a couple of the Colorado River headwater areas. The Eagle River specifically is, again, at the 10% level above the flood stage and at the 75% level above what we consider bank full. So looking at some pretty high flows in that area as well. And then also when you get down, I got Cameo on here showing quite a bit larger flow than what was observed there last year. So and again, that bank full is getting in there close to the 50% exceedance. A couple of the more recreational points, Green River at Green River, Utah, and Cataract Canyon. It should show up here momentarily. There we go. So quite a bit larger flows than what were observed last year. A little bit above average on the Green River, at Green River. Again, I'll always keep emphasizing that regulation causes a lot of this. And then Cataract Canyon, 52,000. There's not a flood stage at Cataract, but showing it a little bit above. Did you have a comment on the green? Does that look okay? All right. And all this information that I've thrown up here is basically available through those lists that Brenda had shown. So that's where I pulled all this. So I'm crossing my fingers I typed everything in correctly here, but this is the type of information you can get off of the list. I really think the listing's a great source. Animus at Durango showing on that left at all forecast distributions were below the bank full and that, but definitely a better flow than last year, and that's really going to kind of drive the forecast in the lower part of the San Juan Basin down near Bluff. Much lower than average, and last year maybe a little bit more. It just depends on the timing. Next up, I'm going to look at a couple more over kind of in the northern Utah and the Duchesne River Basin. Flows over here, despite we had really good soil moisture, we don't have really great snowpack. So lower flows over here, a little bit better than last year, but not by much. So in these areas, we're not really anticipating any problems, but looking at some fairly low, below average flows coming out of the south slopes of the Uinta Range right now. And then into northern Utah, into the Upper Bear and Weaver Basins, Logan River near Logan. Forecast near average, but one thing to keep in mind about the Logan is the average and the flood aren't really all that far apart from one another. In heavy snow years, it seems like the Logan does tend to get up to the flood stage. So this is one to watch. And you can see at that 10% exceedance on the left-hand side in the green vertical bar, it's closing in a little bit on that flood stage. So if we continue to get a building snow pack up above the Logan, it's one to kind of star and keep an eye on. Weaver River near Oakley, a little bit below average. Snowpack's a little bit less there, but could still get a good runoff in there. And then, so basically in summary, the areas I think, what you kind of get out of this are at some part of the forecast distribution that we showed. Flood level is touched at several locations, particularly in the Green River sections in Wyoming. At La Barge, we're exceeding it at the 50% forecast. Headwaters of the Yampa, including the Elk. Colorado River headwaters at State Line above Cameo, including the Eagle. Gunnison River above Blue Mesa, specifically the East River. At some point in the forecast distribution, these are nearer, they touch the flood level, so they're areas to kind of focus on. The Logan River near Logan is somewhat near it at the 10%, so again, it's an area to keep an eye on. I just also want to say, we don't have procedures for every stream flow point and even gauged site that's out there. If there is heavy runoff anticipated in any one of these basins, there very well may be some smaller tributaries that experience, they're going to experience the same type of runoff. So just because we don't have a flood or maybe a high probability of flooding at every single point up there, it doesn't mean that there could be some areas that see some high runoff and maybe some issues. I briefly wanted to just talk about how spring weather really determines things from this point on. And I think a lot of this is just common sense. In large snowpack years, of course, we have that increase in chances for flooding, as we've indicated in some of these areas. It doesn't mean it's inevitable. 2011, we had a very large snowpack, and we had a very favorable melt. So, the spring temperature scenario, the pattern that plays out is going to really drive things. Precipitation during the runoff period, even in years where you may not have a large snowpack, you have reduced capacity in your river channels. So if you get some very large rain events that come in, especially at the certain elevation levels during the peak runoff, we've seen flood issues develop. So that tends to be more of a very short-term precipitation induced type of flooding. Rain events will play a larger role in the magnitude of the peak during very low flow years, low snow years, and that's probably going to be the case in perhaps part of the Virgin River Basin and areas where we're have pretty low snow. But in other areas, it could really enhance things. So in those areas where we have had a heavy snowpack, rain events coming in during that melt, as I mentioned, are going to be something we want to really focus on. And again, Brenda mentioned keeping an eye on our webpage. So briefly, let's take a look at just an impact on the Gunnison River Basin. I'm going to use East River at Almont, ALE, on this plot as an example, and the snowtel above it, the Butte snowtel site. And in 2012 and 2013, in late March, the snow was real similar in both those years. From late March forward, the pattern really diverged. We melted off in 2012, and we increased the snow in 2013. Interesting enough, we actually had better soil moisture conditions in 2012 heading into it, and worse soil moisture conditions in 2013. The spring weather in 2012, we got very warm, very dry, and there we go. And that's on the left-hand side of this graph. You can see where maximum temperature deviation was quite a bit above average in both March and April of 2012. In 2013, not so much. It was near average, in March, and it was cooler than average in April, and we did have a few more storms that moved in. So, and you saw that on that snow trace that we maintained our snow, and in some areas, especially high elevations, we actually increased it. Here's an example of the remote sensing center's idea of the snow distribution in the snow water equivalent in 2012 on the left and 2013. So this is by mid-April. So this is after we got into we diverged in that similar snow of late March. And you can see, it's really melted off in the left-hand image, and we kind of maintained it and actually increased it in the right hand. And the result of that was quite a different stream flow scenario that played out. March in the lower right hand, the 2012 in the lower right hand is in the green for east at Almont, and a fairly early peak compared to what we typically see, and a fairly low peak. And the red was 2013, showing a much larger peak. Yet in late March, the forecast, there's a lot of reason to argue that they may have been very similar. So that just kind of goes to show you, here we are in mid-March and how things might diverge from this point on. And so, look at this as guidance, but also that these could take very different paths from this point out, I guess, depending on the weather. And speaking of the weather, next up, I'll go through the upcoming weather, a couple slides, and then we'll open this for questions. We're still in this progressive pattern with periods of wet and dry, kind of fast-moving storms. That number one is just north of Utah. That's kind of showing the storm system that's kind of over the region now, affecting primarily the northern half of the CBRFC forecast area. That's going to continue to move on and should be out of the area by Wednesday. Storm number two off the coast weakens and kind of pushes into Canada, so we'll go through a period of kind of dry weather towards the end of the week. Storm number three is really off the graphic more than anything, but that's kind of forecast to develop and clip, once again, the upper green, the Yampa, potentially the Colorado River headwaters Saturday. Fast mover, may not bring a lot of precipitation. And then the long-range models, for what they're worth right now, suggest another system early next week and potentially another one late next week that will probably affect more of the Great Basin and maybe more of Colorado as well as Wyoming. So bottom line is we're in this scenario where we're still going to see some quick-moving storms and a buildup, most likely, although maybe not as rapidly. Well, certainly not as rapidly as February, but maybe a more increase in the snowpack in those areas where it's already heavy. Precipitation over the 7-day period from the 11th through the 18th is kind of shown here. Again, from northern Utah, northern Great Basin, Yampa River drainage, parts of the Colorado. But again, it shows kind of where the models at least think the precip focus is going to be. So that's kind of the area that's continued to get it all season. 90-day outlooks, not really much indication on where the precipitation is going to go, just equal chances of above or below. The temperature forecast from the Climate Prediction Center, is increased chances above average in parts of the Great Basin and extending into west and southwest Colorado. It's a more mild air mass, so that kind of makes sense, what we're getting coming in right now with these frequent storms. So that's kind of what, for what that's worth, that's what it looks like in the 90-day. And then finally, the peak flow forecast schedule. We're planning on updating these twice monthly, as Brenda mentioned. It's usually the first week of the month and somewhere in the mid-month, at least into, probably into early June. By then, we only have typically a few sites left to peak. And then the next webinar will be for water supplies April 7th, and we'll most likely do another peak flow one in sometime in mid-April or as needed if things change dramatically. I've also listed the contact points for the peak flows there. And I'm just going to look and see if there's any questions. Okay, nobody's typed any in.
The conference is now in talk mode.
So I've unmuted the conference, and I do have some of the forecasters here with me. So if you do have any specific questions, please speak up. No questions. Okay. So we either confused everybody or hopefully we gave you information that was sufficient. So I guess that's it. If you have any questions or you want to drop us an email or a phone call, I think most of you on here, I've seen you before. You know the routine. You're more than welcome to get in touch with us so we can talk specifically about any forecast points. So thank you for joining us, and we'll be back in April. About 20.
That's good, Greg. Yeah.